Imagine pouring your absolute heart and soul into this massive, sprawling creative project. Like you finally release it into the world, you're holding your breath for the reaction, and the feedback just starts rolling in.
Yeah, the moment of truth.
Exactly. And one person looks at it and calls it this fragmented, calculating, spotty mess, like a complete disaster. But then, and this is the crazy part, another person looks at that exact same project, listens to the exact same audio, and declares it an underappreciated masterpiece that literally predicted the future.
I mean, it is the ultimate creative whiplash, right?
Totally.
But you see this happen frequently with art that just, refuses to fit neatly into a predetermined box. When you break the rules of a genre, you alienate the purists, but you might just be writing the blueprint for the next generation.
Which brings us to exactly why we are here today. So welcome to today's deep dive. We are so thrilled you're joining us because today we are exploring a piece of art that generated exactly that kind of wildly polarized, head-scratching reaction.
It's a really fascinating one.
It really is. We are pulling our insights today from the Wikipedia article detailing the 1989 album titled I by the British musical duo A.R. Kane. And our mission for you today is to basically investigate how a single album can simultaneously be dismissed as an overly ambitious train wreck by some and, well, hailed as a prophetic, visionary triumph by others.
It serves as a fantastic case study. And not just for music history nerds either, but for anyone who's interested in how we evaluate any complex, rule-breaking project, The tension between those two extremes tells us a lot about the expectations we place on creators.
Okay, let's unpack this. To really understand the sheer whiplash of the reaction to I, we have to look at the pedestal A.R. Kane was standing on before they, well, essentially jumped off it.
Right.
They weren't just some run-of-the-mill pop act throwing things at the wall. They had a very specific identity.
Context is absolutely everything here. So the album I was released in October of 1989 on a label called One Little Indian. This was their second studio album. They were coming off their debut record, which is called 69. Sometimes that's just written out as the numbers, 6 and 9. And the critical consensus around that debut was incredibly specific.
How so?
Well, critics praised it for possessing a quality of, quote, organic and uncontrived otherness.
Oh, wow. Organic and uncontrived otherness. I mean, that is one of those critical phrases that sounds beautiful, but also sounds like a complete trap.
It really is a trap.
Right, because if your entire brand is being uncontrived and organically strange, like making this ethereal, floating, avant-garde music,
right,
then any move toward structure or, a mainstream accessibility is instantly going to look like a massive betrayal.
You hit the nail on the head. When you establish yourself as the kings of the underground by being formless and strange, suddenly writing a catchy hook is viewed as a cardinal sin by your core fan base.
Yeah, they feel like you sold out.
Exactly. And that stylistic pivot is exactly what A.R. Kane executed with I. They didn't just subtly tweak their sound. They took a massive, aggressive left turn directly into pop, dance, and electronic styles.
Oh, they're trading those like floating guitars for the dance floor.
Heavily. The album overtly incorporates received rock structures, reggae, and house music. It is a dramatic shift from that floating otherness to the very grounded, heavily structured worlds of clubs and pop charts.
Wait, hold on. By received rock structures, do you just mean they started using like standard verse-chorus, verse formats?
Yeah.
The kind of predictable pop map that everyone else on the radio was already doing?
That is a great translation, yeah. The predictable pop map, they adopted the traditional architecture of a rock or pop song, and they brought in the pulsating, repetitive bass lines of house music and the rhythmic offbeats of reggae.
Wow.
So they were aggressively engaging with genres that had very strict rules, which is the exact opposite of being uncontrived.
It makes me think of an eccentric indie filmmaker, the kind who makes those moody 3-hour black and white films about staring at a wall in silence.
Oh yeah, the festival darlings.
Right. And suddenly they announce they're going to direct a massive, big-budget superhero blockbuster. But on the way to the studio to shoot the superhero movie, they get completely distracted and spend a week at an underground dance club.
I love that.
So the final film is this bizarre hybrid. Right. Moody black and white shots spliced together with neon strobe lights, massive explosions, and a pulsing techno soundtrack.
That is a fantastic way to visualize the friction of this album. You have the ambition of a blockbuster, the accessibility of pop, but the weirdness of the underground club, all violently fighting for space on the exact same record.
Which has to be a marketing nightmare.
Oh, absolutely. And the commercial reality of this pivot is just as paradoxical as the music itself.
Because you would assume that leaning into pop choruses and house music in 1989, like right as dance music is exploding, would guarantee a massive mainstream hit. You're building songs designed to be liked by a wider audience.
You would assume that, but commercially, I actually mirrored its experimental predecessor, 69.
Really?
Yeah, it had moderate overall sales figures. It wasn't a global chart dominator in the mainstream sense. However, it still managed to top the UK independent charts.
That is such a bizarre place to be trapped in. I mean, they're the reigning champions of the indie chart, but they're making an album full of pop choruses and house music that the mainstream isn't actually buying in droves.
Yeah, they were entirely caught between worlds. And because they abandoned their ethereal indie roots for the dance floor, the rock and indie critics were practically lying in wait to tear them apart.
Oh, I bet.
This drastic genre mashing leads us directly into the core tension of our deep dive. Because the negative and mixed reviews are incredibly revealing about the cultural tribalism of the late 1980s.
Let's look at the skeptics then, because they did not hold back at all. Greg Tate, writing for Artforum back in 1990, so this is the immediate reaction to the release, was not buying the pivot at all. He claimed the incorporation of rock, reggae, and house was, quote, spotty.
Yeah, spotty implies a serious lack of cohesion. He's essentially saying the genre experiments feel pasted together rather than naturally integrated.
Like it's forced.
Exactly. But his main critique was even sharper. He said that compared to the organic and uncontrived otherness of their first album, I felt, and this is his phrasing, more rudimentary and more calculating.
Oh, calculating. That is the kill word right there. He is accusing them of artificially constructing these pop and dance tracks to chase a trend, rather than letting their art flow naturally. He's saying the math is showing.
The math is showing, and to a critic who is looking for underground purity, that is unforgivable. And that sentiment didn't just fade away after 1990 either.
Wow.
No, the skepticism followed the album for decades. If you jump forward to 2004, Chris Ott reviewed the album for Pitchfork. He gave it a 7.7 out of 10, which is, technically a positive score, but his written analysis was brutal.
What did he say?
He called it a stylistically incontinent album.
Wait, stylistically incontinent. That is a wildly vivid insult.
It really paints a picture, doesn't it?
It paints a picture of a band that just cannot control their own output. Like they're just leaking genres all over the place without any discipline.
He argued the album was fragmented by unchecked ambition. Ott acknowledged the drastic shift toward clearer production and pop choruses, but he concluded that a listener really had to endure the chaos and wait until the final quarter of the album for it to be capable of convincing anyone of A.R. Kane's genius.
So you're saying the first 3 quarters are just garbage?
Pretty much. For him, the first 3 quarters of this massive experiment were just a sprawling mess of ambition without an editor.
I genuinely have to push back on that Pitchfork perspective, though. Framing unchecked ambition as a negative thing in art feels incredibly backwards to me.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, isn't pushing boundaries, breaking the container, and just throwing everything at the wall exactly what artists are supposed to do? If you are constantly checking your ambition and making sure your genres don't bleed into each other, aren't you just playing it safe?
That is the eternal debate, isn't it? When ambition shatters the listener's expected experience, critics often reach for words like incontinent or fragmented. They want a guided tour, not a chaotic sandbox.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Not everyone saw this chaotic sandbox as a failure. Let's look at the complete opposite side of the spectrum, because the AllMusic review paints a vastly different picture of what A.R. Kane was actually doing.
Right. So Jason Ankeny reviewed the album for AllMusic, and his take is a complete 180-degree turn from the Pitchfork review. He doesn't hear a spotty, rudimentary mess at all.
What does he hear?
He unequivocally calls I an underappreciated masterpiece.
I have to admit, I'm a little skeptical there. Going from stylistically incontinent to underappreciated masterpiece is a massive leap. Is Ankeny just projecting modern musical trends onto a past failure just to make it sound deeper than it actually was?
What's fascinating here is Ankeny's specific reasoning for that leap. He argues that the album, despite being largely overlooked and misunderstood upon its original release, actually functions as a crystal ball.
A crystal ball?
Yes. He says it was prophesying virtually every major musical development of the 1990s.
Okay, so he's suggesting that the genre mashing, the aggressive blending of rock, reggae, house, and pop that sounded like a calculating mess to Greg Tate in 1990 was actually just A.R. Kane mapping out the sonic landscape of the entire next decade before anyone else had the vocabulary for it.
That is the core of his argument. Think about the alternative and dance scenes of the 1990s. They would go on to seamlessly blend electronic beats, indie guitars, and pop hooks. A.R. Kane was doing it in 1989. People simply didn't have the framework to understand it yet. It just sounded like friction. It's only in retrospect, once the rest of the culture catches up, that you can look back and realize the mess was actually a map.
But how does an album physically sound like a crystal ball while also driving professional music critics absolutely crazy? Like, to understand that, I really want to look at the literal structural anatomy of this record.
Let's do it.
Because when you see how it was physically built, you start to completely understand why Pitchfork used a word like incontinent.
Yeah, the sheer scale of the project is staggering, especially for the time. We are talking about an album that runs for 67 minutes and 49 seconds.
Nearly 68 minutes of music. I mean, the compact disc era had just really taken hold, allowing bands to push way past the time limits of a standard vinyl record, and A.R. Kane clearly took full advantage of that extra real estate.
They filled every inch of it. Packed into that 68 minutes is a track list of 26 individual songs.
26 tracks.
Yeah.
And it is not just the volume of songs, it's the chaotic pacing.
Yeah.
You look at the runtimes, and there is zero consistency. You have these sweeping epic anchors holding the album down. Like A Love from Outer Space is over 5 minutes long. Down is 5 minutes and 14 seconds. Super Vixens and Catch My Drift are both exactly 5 minutes and 40 seconds.
Right. Those are massive, immersive deep dives into pop and house music. They require the listener to settle in and lock into a groove.
Right. But then sandwiched directly between those massive immersive tracks are these absurdly short interludes. And I do not mean a minute-long transition. Track 7, titled Off into Space, is exactly 4 seconds long.
4 seconds. You barely have time to register the sound before it's gone.
And track 24, is 5 seconds long. Hello, the very first track that kicks off this entire massive 68-minute journey is 27 seconds. It's a completely dizzying way to sequence an album. You are constantly being pulled in and out of the experience.
It shatters any sense of traditional album flow. You are forced to constantly readjust your attention.
It honestly sounds exactly like scrolling through a modern social media feed.
Oh, that's a good point.
Think about it. You get a 4-second microburst of a meme smashed right up against a 5-minute video essay, immediately followed by a 10-second joke. It is constant, aggressive context switching. Ankeny was entirely right. They really were predicting the future. They predicted the fractured attention economy in 1989.
That is a brilliant analogy. The structural chaos of the album perfectly mirrors the media consumption habits of today. But, to pull off that level of friction, to seamlessly or aggressively transition from a 5-minute house track to a 4-second burst of noise requires an incredibly dense, sophisticated level of production.
I can imagine. To make 26 tracks that bounce between reggae bass lines, classical strings, and 4-second interludes, you can't just have 2 guys tinkering in a garage. They must have had a small army in the studio with them to execute this.
They absolutely did. The album was co-produced by A.R. Kane themselves, alongside Ray Shulman. And just a quick note, A.R. Kane, which consisted of Art Kane and a second musician, just listed as A.R. Kane in the credits they handled arranging, audio production, engineering, guitars, vocals, and multiple instruments.
Okay, so they were busy?
Very busy. But the personnel list surrounding them is massive.
So who was in this army they built?
Well, you have a sprawling roster of engineers. 9 different engineers are credited on this album.
Fine.
9, including notable names like Lincoln Fong, Paul Kendall, and Ken Thomas. You have Benny DeMassa holding down the drums, Colin Cairns on bass, and the vocal textures are wildly varied because they didn't just rely on themselves.
Right.
They brought in multiple outside vocalists, including Maggie Tambala and a mysterious vocalist credited simply as Girl Lorna.
Girl Lorna? That is incredibly iconic. It adds this perfect layer of mystique to the whole production.
It does.
Yeah.
But the real density, the element that truly thickens the sound and creates that friction with the dance beats, comes from the strings. They utilized extensive string sections.
Classical strings on a dance record.
Oh, yeah. Ginny Ball, Sally Herbert, and Jeremy Metcalf on violin, Sue Dench and Jocelyn Pook on viola, Martin McCarrick and Audrey Riley on cello. Plus an entire additional string group credited as the False Harmonies.
Okay, the False Harmonies. That sounds like the villainous rival band in a 1980s teen movie.
Yeah.
It is a spectacular name for a string section.
It really is.
Just imagine trying to mix a delicate classical viola arrangement from the False Harmonies over a heavy synthesized house music bass line. The technical headache of making that sound cohesive must have been immense.
Which is exactly why they needed 9 engineers.
Seriously.
And this brings us to my absolute favorite detail in the entire Wikipedia personnel list.
Oh, I'm ready.
Because amidst all these highly technical engineers, all these classically trained string players, and all this serious, heavy musical architecture, there's a credit for a musician named Chris Tombling.
I am almost afraid to ask. What instrument did Chris Tombling contribute to this 68-minute masterpiece?
Well, Chris Tombling is credited with playing the violin and a balloon.
Wait, a balloon? Like an actual literal balloon?
An actual balloon. Right next to the viola, the cello, and the house music drum machines, we have an official album credit for a balloon.
That is incredible. I can just picture the scene in this grand, serious recording studio, right? You have 9 engineers sweating over the mixing board. The false harmonies are meticulously tuning their cellos. The reggae bass is warming up. And Chris Tombling is just standing completely deadpan in the corner, aggressively rubbing a balloon into a microphone.
It's absurd.
That is the exact kind of unchecked ambition I was defending earlier.
Yeah.
It is pure, chaotic creativity.
I agree completely. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, this massive roster perfectly validates every single critic we've discussed today, both the negative and the positive.
Wait, how does a balloon validate both sides?
Think about it. If you were Greg Tate in 1990 and you are looking for the organic simplicity of their debut, this massive 26-track, balloon-infused, genre-hopping, 9-engineer production absolutely looks like a calculating, spotty mess.
Okay.
Yeah.
It looked entirely incontinent, as Pitchfork argued. It is bloated. But if you are Jason Ankeny looking back from the modern era, you see that throwing all those disparate elements into a blender, the house music, reggae, classical strings, micro tracks, and literal balloon noises, was exactly the blueprint that alternative music would eventually follow.
So the chaos was the prophecy.
Exactly. Both critics are looking at the exact same data points, just through different historical lenses.
So what does this all mean? What can you, listening to this deep dive right now, take away from the strange, polarizing 26-track story of A.R. Kane's I? I think the fundamental takeaway is a defense of unchecked ambition in your own life. Whether you are an artist, an entrepreneur, trying to build a business, or just someone trying to solve a problem in a completely new way, do not be afraid to be a little stylistically incontinent. Do not be afraid to put the 4-second absurd idea right next to the 5-minute serious master plan, because the messy, fragmented balloon-rubbing project you are stressing over today might just be recognized as a crystal ball tomorrow.
I love that. It is about trusting your own process, even when it looks completely chaotic to the outside world. Which actually brings me to one final fascinating detail from the source material that I want to leave you with today.
Okay.
The Wikipedia page notes an interesting paradox regarding the title of the album, and it raises a really profound question about the nature of the ego in collaborative art.
Ooh, okay. Lay the puzzle on us.
The title of this sprawling album is just the letter I, and importantly, it is stylized as a lowercase I.
A lowercase I. Just a tiny single letter.
Yet, as we have just spent this entire deep dive discussing, this is a 67-minute, 26-track mammoth of a record. It features a massive ensemble of string players, 9 different engineers, multiple vocalists, and balloon players.
Right.
It is the very definition of a sprawling, highly collaborative effort. Furthermore, the text notes that A.R. Kane was no stranger to massive crowded collaborations. They were actually part of the supergroup Mars and had a massive hit single together called Pump Up the Volume.
Oh, wow. Pump Up the Volume was a massive cultural touchstone, so they absolutely knew how to play nicely in a crowded room. They weren't just isolated hermits.
Exactly. So here is the puzzle for you to mull over today as you go about your work. Why name this specific album the most bloated, creatively dense, highly collaborative project imaginable after the smallest, most singular concept of the self?
That is a wild contrast.
Right. Is the lowercase I simply an ironic inside joke by the band about how massive the project got? Or does it represent something deeper about the creative process? Does the lowercase I represent the shrinking of the individual ego, dissolving into the massive collective chaos of the art itself?
Is it the ultimate ego trip to name a universe after yourself, or is it the death of the ego entirely? That is a brilliant question to leave off on. We hope you enjoyed this deep dive into the chaotic, prophetic world of A.R. Kane. Thank you so much for joining us, and keep exploring those messy masterpieces.
Until next time.